In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to set up a Chatbot UI in Next.JS. We're going to be using a Langchain for all the natural language processing tasks. We're going to be using a Vercel AI's SDK for the communication between the front end and back end of our application, as well as the streaming that you see on screen here. We're going to be using Upstash Redis that's going to be responsible for storing all of our chat history, as well as the different threads that we're going to be setting up here. And then finally, for the front end, we're going to be using ShadCN UI alongside with Tailwind for all of our styling. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to point you over to the ShadCN UI. So you can actually start straight from this to start the whole project if you'd like. So you can run through and create a Next app by yourself, or you can just grab what they have here to create a project here. So if you just copy this and change out the app name, maybe if you'd like, you can take that command, pop over to VS Code, and run that within your terminal. Now, once that's set up, while we're on the ShadCN UI page here, you can just go ahead and initialize it from the CLI. And you can just run through these steps here. I'm not actually going to run through this step by step, but very self-explanatory. So do you want to use TypeScript? In this video, I am going to be using it. And the one thing I will note is if you do want to pull the repo for this video, you can do that as well and just follow along the video alongside the repo, or however you see fit, however you will best learn. The thing with this is once this is all set up and wired, the really neat thing with this library or framework or whatever we want to call it is you'll be able to just add in the components by running this command. So if you run npx ShadCN UI add button, that will be how you add a button component within a UI folder in your project. So I'll just show you that quickly. So I have a components folder within my project here, like you see. So as soon as you go ahead and run a command like add the button, it will go ahead and populate the components that you want to install directly in this folder. And then when you go ahead and you want to link it, you'll see how I do that once I go into the other components. So once you have that all set up, it also shows you here as well how you can import them. So import button from @components, UI /button, etc. So we're going to be leveraging just a few of these in this example. We're going to be using the button and text area, but we're also going to be using one of the examples that they show here. So I just grabbed this sidebar from their front page there, and you can go within the components here and just grab this sidebar nav. So I just copied this over, I didn't make any tweaks, and I just put that within the UI folder as well. So you can go ahead and try that out, just install those buttons if you'd like, and once you have those, that's pretty much it for styling. That's all we're going to be leveraging directly from ShadCN UI, and the rest is going to be implemented with just Tailwind classes throughout our front end. So once we have all that set up, we can go ahead and make a .env file. So as you see on screen here, you see the three things that we're going to be looking out for. So we're going to have to hunt down our OpenAI API key and a couple Upstash Redis variables. So OpenAI, a very easy one to go ahead and grab. If you have an OpenAI account, just go to the API keys page. You can just click the top right hand corner here where your name is, and then view API keys, create a new key, copy it over. Just make sure that it's OpenAI _API _key. Paste it in. Then for Redis, so once you've made your database, you can go ahead within it. So again, I'll show you. So you go Redis, and you can click the instance of your database here. You see that you have 10,000 free commands per day, and I found the easiest way to grab the variables that you need is just go to Upstash Redis here, and you're going to have your URL and your token. So if you just show those, I'm not going to be showing mine here, but you can just put them in just as you see here. So Upstash _ Redis _ rest _ URL. Put them in one by one. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and close out and save your .env. All right, so once we're within our package JSON, I'm just going to show you the few things that we're going to install. So we're going to npm I at upstash /redis. We're going to install AI.env and Langchain. So I'm not going to run those, but you can go ahead and get those installed. So next, I'm just going to show you a little bit of the structure that we're going to be setting up here. So we have our app itself, and then adjacent to it, we have our components. We have within our components our Shad UI components, like I showed you. We're going to have two components. So I wanted to keep this simple. You could break this up further. Maybe if you wanted that text area to be a separate component as well, you could do that. But we have our chat area and our sidebar. So you can sort of think of it as the left side and the right side of our app. And from there, we have our app itself. And then within the app, we have two routes within our API. So we have chat to handle all of the chat logic. And then we have the retrieve history, which you can sort of think of it as the backend that's more or less bound to that sidebar. So to show all our history and threads that are within the database. Then in terms of pages themselves, so we have one main page that does basically all of the primary logic there. And then we have a home page here, which is just going to be very simple, just a click here to start a conversation. But you can tweak this as you see fit. So once we have our structure set up, just like I showed you, so you could just pause the video if you're going through this bit by bit, or if you're following along with a repo, just so you sort of have an understanding here. You can sort of you look through it and listen to me explain however you see you like to do it. So once you have the directories all set up, I'm just going to fold some of these. I have everything open here, and the way that I'm going to be going through this is I'm going to be showing you block by block all of the different portions of the code that we're going to be writing out. So I'm going to be showing you the back end. I'm going to work myself to the front end, and then that's going to be it. So it's not going to take too long to get this all set up, and feel free to revisit this video if I run through something relatively fast, or always just really look for that repo if you want something that's easy to copy and paste, or you need a little sample of trying to do something. Feel free to do that as well. So what we're going to do first, I'm just going to expand the sidebar a little bit just so we can see what we are working in. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to work on our chat route. So this is going to be the sort of the biggest part, arguably, of our backend, but still relatively straightforward. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import a handful of modules. So we're going to import Redis. We're going to import Upstash Redis chat message history. So that's the wrapper that's within Langchain that the team at Upstash has implemented. We're going to be using the chat OpenAI model from Langchain. We're going to be using buffer memory from Langchain, the conversation chain, and then finally we're going to be using streaming text response and the Langchain stream from the Vercel AI SDK. So first we're just going to initialize our Redis client here. So if you use the environment variable keys like I had shown you, you can just go redis from env here to load that all up. And then from here, you can specify the runtime if you'd like. So if you want to deploy this to something like the Vercel Edge functions, you can go ahead and specify it like I have here. If you want to implement this on something else like AWS Lambda, there's going to be a little bit of a different setup for the runtime, but that's what that is. And then from there, we're going to be setting up the post function itself in Next.JS. What we're going to be doing is we're going to destructure a couple things from our Langchain stream here, so the stream and the handler, and you'll see how we use these. So we're going to parse the response that we get from the front end. So we're going to be taking in the messages, the user ID, and load messages here. Now the user ID is one that I'm going to show you from the front end. There's a particular way on how you pass additional payloads outside of the ones that are built in to the Vercel AI SDK. So I'm going to touch on that. It is super useful if you're trying to pass in other things as well. So here we're just going to load the chat if it's requested. So if by request, we're going to have, if there's the user ID and load messages, it's going to reach into the database directly, and it's going to get those all for us. Now the thing with this is, I also see a little mistake here, but we'll just get rid of that in just a moment. Now the thing with this is you'll be able to use their Langchain client, or you can use the core Redis client as well. So you sort of have the option. So with Langchain stuff, like you can use it the quote unquote Langchain way. I would encourage you, if you're running into issues with a wrapper, don't hesitate to reach for the actual client themselves. Just remember you're within Node or Next, within the environment. If you can install these things and have libraries to use, just do what works best for you. So we're going to load and pre-populate the messages. I'm loading it directly from the Redis client here. Then from here, we're going to initialize the memory buffer and chat history here. So this is going to be where we actually set up the Upstash Redis chat message history, but we're going to pass in the session ID, which is going to be the user ID and the timestamp, which I'll be showing you a little bit more as we go through this. Then we're going to be passing in the client itself. So from there, we're going to be initializing our chat model. So in this one, I'm using chat or GPT 3.5 Turbo. You can use GPT 4 if you want. Specify that streaming's true. And now in this, if we want those fast responses and we don't want like a synthetic output of the stream from the backend, make sure you enable streaming, because that's one of the big pluses and advantages of using something like the Vercel AI SDK. So we're going to initialize the conversation chain. This is going to be where we put in the memory that we previously initialized and the model. Now we're going to get the last message from the conversation, and that's what we're going to pass within the our conversation chain. And because we're specifying the memory above here, we don't need to pass in like a message array like you might have seen in other OpenAI API examples. And then this is going to be how we trigger the callback for the Langchain stream here. So that's what that handler is. And then finally, this is going to be how we output our streaming response to the front end. So that's it for the chat component. So even though it's sort of the larger piece of the back end, still not that many lines of code, right? Less than 50 lines of code with comments. So next we're going to just pop over, while we're on the chat functionality of the app, we're going to hop over to our chat area component for the front end. So we're going to import some of the necessary components here. So you have the usual suspects: use effect, use layout effect, form event, use ref. Now we're going to be using refs so it scrolls, continues to scroll as the messages come up, so that chat doesn't get hidden behind the input. That's going to be how we handle that. And then from there, I'm going to be setting up our chat area component. You're going to see some of the TypeScript interfaces and whatnot as I set up. I'm not going to focus on those. You can just see them here and copy them over into your app, but I'm not going to sort of dwell on those too long. So here we're going to get the parameters. So the parameters are going to be the latter portion of the input within our URL. And then we're going to be using all of these different pieces from the Vercel AI SDK. So this use chat function has all of these different custom chat hooks available to us. So in this, we have our handle load chat function. And basically what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be passing in the user ID. I also showed you how you can pass in additional options here. So here I'm passing in testing. You can pass in a whole bunch of other keys here, but the portions that our backend actually functions on is the user ID and load messages. So from there, once it's returned, we're going to make sure that there's actually a length, and then we're just going to do a little bit of filtering. So on the front end, we're going to filter through, we're going to specify whether it's human or a user, and then these are going to be what dictate whether it's on the left-hand side or right-hand side, whether it's a blue bubble or a gray bubble, all of that stuff. You can also use these roles as the keys within the UI. So if you actually want to show someone's name or icon associated or whatever, you can leverage these for that. And then we're just going to set the messages, and that's going to be how our app chat area will ultimately map these out. So we're going to handle our submits. So we're going to listen for the enter key on our text area. And then if it's has that enter key, we're going to trigger that core handle submit. So our handle submits wrapped in a handle all submits because we're listening for that enter key. And then we're also passing in some additional options. So next we're going to specify the ref for our message container. And like I mentioned, this is what we're going to use to make sure that our chat doesn't fall behind our text area and it scrolls up naturally as you'd expect as the messages come through. So this is essentially going to be how we do that. We're going to be using the layout effect as well. So it's going to be listening for when the messages change to trigger this. So then we're just going to be rendering out our component here. So I'll just word wrap this here. So essentially the main part of this is going to be if there are messages, it's going to loop through them. It's going to give a class name, whether it's a user or not. So depending on the role, it will position them differently. And then from there, you can specify the colors of your bubbles. And then finally, the content of the message itself. After that, we just have a simple text area for our form itself, and that's the text area that we're incorporating from the Shad UI. So you see here our components. So we have components, UI, text area, components, button. That's pretty much it for our chat area. So that wraps up the chat portion. And then from here, it's going to be pretty smooth sailing. So for our backend of the retrieve chat history, so just our sidebar there, similar setup for our Redis. So we're just going to import Redis. We're going to initialize our environment variables. We're going to specify our runtime, set up our interface for TypeScript. Then we're going to be getting a couple different things from the front end here. So we're going to have our user ID and the chat history action. Now I put this in case you wanted to scale this out. So say if you wanted to add in the functionality to delete a particular chat history, you could set up some logic here within this, depending on the action. So just showed you a little bit about how you could potentially think about a route like this. And then from there, we're going to just go and query for the user ID. And then we have this wildcard here. So anything with that user ID, so in this case, that UUID ABC123 that you see within the URLs here. So you see UUID ABC123. That front portion is going to be the user ID, and then it's going to get all of the timestamps, and that's going to be how it gets this sidebar here. And then it's just going to return those. And if there's an error, it's going to return that. And then similar as you might expect for the front end, we're just going to do a lot of the same things that we just did. Incorporate a handful of things, button with the sidebar nav that we got from ShadCN UI. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set up the interface for TypeScript here. We're going to set up a couple of them, and then we're going to start defining our component. So we're going to get the parameters from the URL like we have in the others. We're going to specify the router here. We're going to handle the retrieve sidebar. So this is going to be where we actually go and make a request for that backend logic that we just set up. If the response is okay, we're simply going to go ahead. We're going to reverse that chat history, and then we're going to map through this, and we're going to set it so we have the href to be /chat history, and the title is going to be a nice parsed version instead of that Unix time like you see in the URL. So instead of Unix time that you see here, it's going to parse it just to be a more friendly, readable format for us. So next, we're going to check and see if a specific chat ID is provided within the URL params. Then from there, we're going to parse out the Unix time, and we're going to put that title just like you see here. Again, set it within the top of our list here. And now the thing with this portion here is the way that it's set up is if you click new chat, but you don't actually submit something, it's not going to log it within this sidebar. So this sidebar is only going to have conversations that have actively been stored within the Redis instance. So that's a bit of that conditional logic that's happening. So if you just keep clicking new chat, new chat, new chat, if you go and refresh the page, it's not going to have a number of new chats here. It's only going to keep the chat histories that have messages within them. So that's just a feature so it doesn't clutter it up with a bunch of empty chat history boxes, but sort of optional. You could remove that if there's a use case where that could be what you're looking to do, but that's a bit of this conditional logic here. Then we're just going to handle out any errors if they come up. Then next, we're going to set up a function to actually create that new chat. So if we click that button, and then we're going to set up the use effect for when the component initially mounts to this screen. And then our render function here is pretty straightforward. So we have our button with our new chat where we bind our handle update sidebar, and then we have our ShadCN UI example of a sidebar that accepts the props of items. So pretty straightforward for that component, and that pretty much wraps the two main components that we're going to be writing out from scratch. That wraps the two endpoints that we're going to be setting up, and then finally it's just setting up the pages. So if I just collapse out our components, I collapse out our API, we're almost there. We just have two more things that we're going to be going through, and one is super fast and simple. So within the root of our directory, all that we're going to have for the home page of this, I kept it simple. You just click for your first chat, and it's going to start this out, and it's going to push this to the router here with a new timestamp. And we're just going to specify, we're going to say this is we're using the client in this, and then our homepage is simply going to be the user ID. So this is going to be where, say, if you were using an authentication service, you could use something that's unique to the user. And then from there, we're going to have our handle click. So on click of the button, we're going to simply push and route our user to what that user ID is and the timestamp. So this could be a potential entry point for your authentication if you want to layer that into your application. So then next within our application, we have the page of chat history, and because it's dynamic, we have the brackets around our ID here, and then we have our page. So this one's also very simple. So we're going to incorporate a couple things here. So here we're going to be requiring the components that we just wrote, so our sidebar and our chat area, and then we're going to specify our user ID once again. And then all that we're going to do is simply wrap our two components here. We're going to pass in the props of our user ID, and then we're going to pass in the chat ID as well, and our set chat ID, just so it's able to communicate amongst them. So that's pretty much it. I know this was a little bit of a longer video, but I wanted to cover as much as I could from scratch. Like I mentioned, there's going to be a repo for all of this. So I know even though it was a little bit longer than some of my other videos, I probably went through some portions relatively fast. So use the repo, ask questions in the comments if you have any. I'm pretty responsive to my comments. I'll try and help out where I can. And yeah, I want to thank Upstash for sponsoring this video. If you found this video useful, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. I also recently set up a Patreon, which I'll link in the description. If you're interested, you can subscribe to that if you'd like, but otherwise just like the video. That's more than enough. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this one. I hope you found it useful, and otherwise, until the next one.